The monsoons of the Indian Ocean reverse every 6 months. December to March, the winds blow northeast. April to November, southwest. In the days before engines, this allowed merchants to travel between Africa and Asia and return the same year. Such fantastic sailing conditions led to the rise of a truly global trading system. Today, as part of this African History collab, link in pinned comment, I'm going to take a look at the southernmost tip of this network, the medieval Islamic city-states of the Swahili coast, and discuss their origins, trade networks, societies, and engineering achievements. Before I start though, just a quick note on terminology. The word Swahili is relatively modern. It gained popularity in the 19th century. I won't get into the origins of the term as it's a little complicated and out of the scope of this video, but just bear in mind that in the periods I'm talking about, the people who lived on the coast of East Africa probably wouldn't have considered themselves Swahili. Each city had its own identity and particular history that happened to share some common themes, which I'm going to discuss. Also, as always, please forgive any mispronunciation. The history of the Swahili coast is one of many that European colonists got horribly wrong. It was believed that because the Swahili people, or Waswahili, were Muslim and lived in cities, that their whole culture was just imported from Arabia. Since the 1980s, modern archaeological methods have overturned this viewpoint. Although these cities would become influenced by Arabic culture, and many would marry into Arabic families, what we see in the archaeological record is a really complicated interaction between coastal farming and fishing Bantu-speaking groups, Cushitic hunting and pastoral groups that lived inland, and foreign traders. The genetic evidence, archaeology, and architecture of the Swahili coast all point to its deep African roots. The origins of these towns probably began with an event archaeologists call the Bantu expansion. Around the turn of the first millennium BCE, farming, iron-producing, and Bantu-speaking populations spread out from their homeland in and around modern Cameroon. Whether by indigenous adoption or migration, iron use and farming reached the Swahili coast by the early first millennium CE. The wide variety of landscapes, diverse populations, and varying subsistence patterns probably precipitated the trading networks that these towns would come to rely on. Each community would bring the specific produce of their area to coastal hubs to trade. The first mention of the Swahili coast in historical records predates Islam considerably and comes from the Periplus Maris Erythrae, a Greco-Roman document written in and about the year 50 CE. This document describes how Roman ships would travel as far as Ras Hufan in modern Somalia, but they would trade with people who would sail much further south, to Rapta and Manauthius. Sadly, we don't know exactly where these two places are. Manauthius might have been Pemba in Zanzibar. Roman pottery from the 5th century has been found on the island, so this is entirely possible. Rapta was probably in the area of the Rufiji River. Ptolemy wrote that the people of Rapta were called the Rafiji Ethiops, and the people that live there to this day are still called the Wa Rafiji. Now, nothing lasts forever, and as the Roman Empire fell into decline and the Islamic world came to prominence, the cities of the Swahili coast continued to expand their trade with the outside world. Eventually, they would adopt Islam themselves by the 11th century. This seems to have been a very gradual process and one they undertook willingly. There's no evidence either archaeologically or in written sources to suggest a migration or invasion by Muslim armies. The oldest mosque discovered so far was found at Shanga and dates to around 780. However, the Arabic writer al-Masudi visited the coast in the 10th century and wrote, "Every man worships what he pleases, be it a plant, an animal, or a mineral." Clearly, this conversion took several centuries. The reasons behind the Swahili people adopting Islam were no doubt very complicated. First, we can tell from archaeological remains that substantial numbers of Swahili people lived in southern Arabia. These were presumably traders who were waiting for the return of the southern monsoons to carry them home. Second, in a world where slavery was extremely commonplace, it may have provided the Swahili merchants with a degree of protection from enslavement. Finally, it politically and legally connected the Swahili merchants and elites to the Islamic world, which at the time was a global powerhouse, stretching all across Eurasia. Islam didn't just bring commercial advantages, though, it also gave the Swahili a written alphabet, and until the 19th century, Swahili was written in the Arabic script. The city-states of East Africa grew wealthy from their ability to facilitate and control trade between mainland Africa and Eurasia. From inland Africa, they would import raw materials such as ivory, iron, wood, spices, gold, and slaves, although I hesitate to call humans a raw material. In exchange for these items, they would trade luxury goods produced by craftspeople in these cities, particularly cotton, salt, pottery, and metal tools. The raw materials that weren't manufactured into something by Swahili craftsmen and women would be loaded onto mtepe, the traditional Swahili ships, and exported to Asia in return for luxury items produced abroad. Silks and fine pottery were particularly popular. These would very rarely be traded outside of the coast and typically stayed the property of the coastal elites. As you can imagine, this is a real sweet position to be in, and it generated extraordinary wealth. They were able to trade ivory and gold for cotton and keep the wealth of the Islamic world to themselves. Not gonna lie, that's a pretty sweet thing you had going there, Swahili coast. The city-state of Kilwa in particular was able to grow extremely wealthy from its ability to control the gold trade out of Great Zimbabwe and its port town of Sofala. The scale of these trade networks was truly astounding, and no item signifies this better than Chinese pottery. Thousands upon thousands of pieces of Chinese pottery have been recovered from the Swahili coast from throughout the medieval period. These would have been displayed in the homes and tombs of Swahili merchants. The more exotic pottery you had, the greater your wealth and the greater the feasting would have been at your house. This trade may have started as soon as these towns were established on the coast. 4 tusks of African male elephants were buried with Emperor Wen in the end of the first millennium BCE. Before I researched this more thoroughly, I had presumed that as 8,668 kilometers separates the Swahili coast from southern China, that they didn't know that they were trading with each other. I presumed everything was being managed by the Islamic empires of the Middle East and India, but I was wrong. That was not the case. In the new book of the Tang dynasty, written in around the year 1060, Chinese authors write about envoys from the kingdom of Gan Tang arriving in the capital Chang'an. That's a good tongue twister. This was in the year 639, roughly. Gantang is believed to have been either Pemba or Zanzibar. Throughout the medieval period, these diplomatic missions repeatedly took place. The Chinese explorer and diplomat Zheng He also visited the Swahili coast in his voyage across the Indian Ocean, returning with exotic animals to wow the imperial Chinese court. So what was life like for the people in these cities? Well, from the 19th century we have descriptions of the different social classes that made up Swahili society. At the top were the mercantile elites, the Waungwana. Underneath them, the Wazalia, freed slaves or children whose fathers were free but mothers were slaves. Below that, the Watumwa, who were still slaves, and below them even the Wageni, visitors or recent immigrants. We also know of various hereditary and political positions, such as the Mzale, or guardian of the soil who controlled land rights, and the Baraze ya Wazi, a council of elders who would advise the Sultan. Although these provide valuable insights into traditional Swahili society, scholars are not sure how much these groups were influenced by the centuries of Omani and then European colonialism. What we can see in these historical ethnologies, though, is a clear concern with kinship, connection to the land, and how recently your ancestors moved into these cosmopolitan centers. We see these same concerns in the archaeological record. Wealthy Swahili families constructed large tombs, stone houses, and occasionally organized towns along clan lines. At Shanga, the central square of the town was surrounded by 7 distinct residential areas, each having their own entrance to the square. Commercial activity varied in each domestic area, and it's possible that they represented different ethnic groups or merchant classes. Considering these cities thrived on international trade, it's no surprise that these would have been really cosmopolitan places to live. We have direct archaeological evidence for various Arabic, Persian, and Indian craftsmen and merchants living in these towns. Not surprisingly, therefore, this is reflected in the DNA of the Swahili people. Of the ancient skeletons analyzed so far, roughly 55% of male Swahili remains had non-African Y chromosomes, and 30% of the mitochondrial DNA, that's inherited from your mother, was non-African. The majority of this non-African DNA comes from the area around the Strait of Hormuz. Now, this does not prove the old colonial theory, though. Scholars believe this was a gradual mixing of people during the medieval period. All the archaeology still suggests that these towns were African in origin. Even when the historical record confirms Arabic or Persian people rose to power in these towns, it is many centuries after their foundation. Speaking of power, historical sources show that women could hold political office. Very progressive of you, Swahili Coast. Several times in the historical record, queens held power, such as Mwane Mkisi, the 13th century ruler of Mombasa, and the Queen of Zanzibar, who was a key ally of the Portuguese in the 16th century. The merchants and sultans of these towns had a small problem. Lots of money, lots of access to skilled craftsmen, but very little stone on these small islands to make palaces, mosques, and castles with. Ingeniously, though, the Swahili people became experts at building in coral, which they were able to quarry from underwater along the coast. No city illustrates this better than Kilwa Kisiwani. Here's what the Portuguese had to say about the place. The city is large and is of good buildings of stone and mortar with terraces, and the houses have much woodworks. The city comes down to the shore and is entirely surrounded by wall and towers, within which there may be 12,000 inhabitants. They are also totally impressed with Kilwa's fat-tailed sheep. Medieval Kilwa was full of fantastic buildings. The Great Mosque is a particularly stunning example. Started in the 11th century and expanded in the 14th, it's full of these beautiful arches and domed roofs. Remember, this isn't stone, it's coral. I don't know why, but I just find that really fascinating. It really intrigues me. Never even heard of anyone building in coral before. Another stunning building is the Husuni Kubwa Palace, built by Sultan Al-Hassan bin Suleiman in the 14th century. Although it seems it was never quite finished, it contains huge courtyards for receiving guests and conducting the Sultan's business, but brilliantly, in truly decadent fashion, the Sultan constructed himself an ocean-front bathing pool. The Sultans of Kilwa weren't only concerned with chilling poolside, though. None of this wealth would have been possible if the gold trade from Sofala was threatened. To ensure the boats could safely enter the harbour, the Sultans of Kilwa constructed huge causeways which marked the edge of coral reefs and indicated safe points to enter the harbour at high tide. The scale of these projects is really incredible. Some of the larger causeways are 500 meters long, 60 meters wide, and consisted of uncemented coral rubble piled on top of the bedrock to raise it visibly above the sea level. Creating such large causeways would have taken thousands of people to quarry and prepare the coral, and building up the causeways in the ocean cannot have been an easy task. It just shows how important trade was to these rulers. No expense was spared to ensure the gold kept flowing. Hey everyone, Stefan here. Thanks for watching my video. Sorry about the whispering. It's super late at night and my wife will kill me if I wake her up. Don't let this African-themed fun stop here. Check out From Nothing's video. He's talking about the history of Ghana, Susu, Mali, Songhai empires every year, 300 BCE, to 1670. That's insane. Or you could check out Al Makadama's video on the Arabic slave trade. Thanks very much to my top tier Patreons. I hope you enjoyed the video. There's so much more to the Swahili culture than I mentioned today. This is just the very general themes. Each city had its own culture, political system, thing going on. Do look into it more if you're interested. Skilly bing bong boo. Good night.